Hey guys, so today I'm going to try something new. I'm trying a video blog or vlog to tie together part of a three-part series that I've been working on explaining the exposure triangle. So before I get into it, I just want to point out that I did have three blog posts talking about each side of the exposure triangle. So triangle's three sides, so I've got three blog posts talking about each side of that exposure triangle. And just to remind you of what the exposure triangle is it's basically aperture, ISO, shutter speed, all working together to get you that exposure or your image. And each of these things, aperture, ISO, shutter speed, have an impact on how your image looks. So for example, aperture controls depth of field. And if you think about portrait work or anything that you want to work with macro photography that has that really blurry background, that aperture setting is very important. So knowing which setting to get that blurry background will be controlled by aperture. Your ISO is a little bit challenging to like understand visually because what it actually relates to is image quality and noise. So with ISO, it actually is a setting that controls how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. So if you have a setting of your ISO that is really high, let's say ISO 1000, it's going to be more sensitive and let in more ambient light versus ISO 100, which is not going to be as sensitive and let in as much light. Think of it as whether or not you're shooting in a large light or dark situation. If you're going into a very bright sunny day and you're shooting a portrait session, you don't need to have a really high ISO because there's already so much ambient light available for your camera. So you can have a low ISO setting. And a low ISO setting won't result in a lot of noise. The higher that number gets, you're going to be introducing a lot of noise to your image, and it can really start to degrade the quality of the final output. And then let's say you're shooting in a dark situation, let's say indoors or on a cloudy day, you might need to have a higher ISO to let in more of that ambient light. And but what you're going to do is introduce noise. So it's sort of a fine balance with ISO. And then shutter speed, to me, when I think of shutter speed, it's all about motion. And a good example that I like to use is, let's say you're taking pictures of your kiddos and they're running around like crazy, and you're always wondering, why can't I get it sharp? Why can't I get them in focus? They're always blurry. It's probably because your camera isn't selecting a high enough shutter speed for you. You may be shooting in an automatic mode or a semi-automatic mode, or maybe you're shooting in manual mode and still not getting that shutter speed to be high enough to freeze the motion. If you have a low shutter speed, that's where you're going to introduce that blur. If you have a high shutter speed, you're likely going to be able to freeze the moment. But what happens is you're not letting in as much light with a high shutter speed. Again, go back to all my posts to sort of remind yourself what these things are. But what I want to do is explain how you can actually control for these to get the image you want. So when I talk about control, what I'm talking about is shooting in manual mode. And that is really the only way that you're going to get full control over your camera. If you are scared of manual mode, I do have a blog post on aperture priority mode, which I would say is a good in between if manual really freaks you out, but like you really want to work on, experimenting with different settings. Visit my post on aperture priority. Otherwise, manual mode. Manual mode allows you to pick your settings. And so I shoot in manual mode, and what I always go to first is thinking about my image and what sort of output I want. So let's say I'm doing a branding session or portrait session, and I know I want that blurry background. My initial thought is, okay, I want a low f-stop number, which is your aperture number. I'm going to go with like 2.8, maybe 3.2, something lower to get that blurry background. From there, I know that, okay, let's say it's a sunny day. I know that I can get away with a low ISO, so I'm going to set my ISO low. And then from there, all I have to do is dial in my shutter speed until my light meter gets to 0. You're probably wondering what a light meter is. Light meter is actually a thing in your viewfinder, or in some cases might actually just be the back of your camera, depending on how your camera is put together and the design and year and everything. So, but I'm gonna change this over to a different view. I have a recording of me adjusting the back of my camera. You can actually see what the light meter is, see how it moves. There's going to be a plus side and a negative side. Plus means that you're going to have like a higher overexposed image. Negative means that you're going to have underexposed, but I'm going to show you how that works based on setting my aperture actually at 2.8. So in some cases, portrait mode, if I'm going to be shooting portrait work, I will go down to aperture 2.8, f2.8, and from there I'll dial in my settings. So stay tuned. I'm going to switch that over and you guys are going to see that. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this and I hope it makes sense. And let me know if you guys have questions. All right, guys, here is your light meter. Plus, minus. Darker image, brighter image. Plus means that you'll get an overexposed image. Negative means you'll get a underexposed image. What we want is right in the center. So basically, here are my settings. We've got f2.8 at ISO 100, 1/20th of a second. This is saying that we're going to get an underexposed image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my dial back here for my camera is adjusting the shutter speed. That's all I'm doing is making it a little bit slower to get to that perfect center exposure. And that's really the essentials of shooting in manual mode. I've controlled for my my f-stop, which is going to give me a really nice blurry background at a low ISO with not a lot of noise, very little noise in my image, and a shutter speed that should be good. 100 of a shutter speed is still kind of slow. So if I wanted to increase my shutter speed, I could do that, but what you're going to see is that image is going to be underexposed. So I could increase my ISO. Let's say I can increase it to, let's go to 250. And then at 200th of a second, I am at perfect exposure. It's right in the center. So that's sort of how you manage your settings when you're in manual mode, and how your aperture, your ISO, and shutter speed all work together. All these other settings I can talk to you guys about if you have questions about them, but that's essentially how you guys shoot in manual mode and how all of these things tie together. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you enjoyed. Thanks, guys.